1. The morning sun beat down on the Las Vegas streets as Michael Warner stepped out of his taxi. He stood for a moment, looking up at the modern building that housed the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department. The glass doors reflected the bright Nevada sky, almost blinding him as he approached. Michael wasn't the kind of man who usually visited police stations. At 65, with his gray hair neatly combed and wearing an expensive suit that looked slightly out of place in the summer heat, he appeared more like a businessman or perhaps a retired politician than someone with police business. The security guard at the entrance nodded at him. "Can I help you, sir?" "I'm here to speak with whoever is in charge," Michael said. His voice carried a certain authority that made the young guard straighten his posture. "Do you have an appointment, sir?" "No, but they'll want to see me." Michael smiled, the kind of smile that suggested he knew something others didn't. The guard hesitated before picking up his phone. After a brief conversation, he directed Michael to the front desk where a police officer was waiting. "Sir, I understand you'd like to speak with someone in charge. Can I ask what this is regarding?" The officer was polite but firm, already dealing with a busy morning at the station. "It's about the Henderson case," Michael said quietly. The officer's expression changed immediately. The Henderson case had been all over the news for weeks, a series of robberies that had left the police stumped. 3 jewelry stores hit in 3 weeks, with no leads and no suspects. "One moment, please." The officer disappeared down a hallway. Michael stood patiently in the lobby. Other visitors glanced at him curiously. He didn't look nervous or upset like most people who came to the police station. Instead, he appeared calm, almost like he belonged there. 5 minutes later, a tall woman in a detective's badge approached. "I'm Detective Sarah Martinez. I understand you have information about the Henderson case." "I do," Michael confirmed. "Is there somewhere we can talk privately?" Detective Martinez led him to a small interview room. The walls were bare except for a clock and a bulletin board with various notices. The table between them was scratched from years of use. "So, Mr. Warner?" "Michael Warner." "Mr. Warner, what information do you have about the Henderson case?" Detective Martinez had her notebook ready, pen poised to write. What happened next surprised everyone in the Las Vegas Police Department. Michael reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet bag. He carefully emptied its contents onto the table. 3 diamond rings, each with a distinct setting that Detective Martinez immediately recognized from the case files. "I believe these belong to the owners of those jewelry stores," Michael said calmly. Detective Martinez stared at the diamonds, then back at Michael. "Sir, are you confessing to the Henderson robberies?" Michael shook his head. "No, Detective. I'm returning what was stolen. My son is the one who took them." A heavy silence filled the room. Outside, the normal activity of the police station continued. Phones ringing, officers talking, the sounds of a typical day. But inside this small room, time seemed to stand still. "Your son?" Detective Martinez finally asked. Michael nodded, his eyes showing a father's pain. "Yes, and I'm here to help you find him before he does something worse." No one at the Las Vegas Police Department had expected their day to unfold like this. As word spread through the station, officers gathered near the interview room, wondering what would happen next with this unexpected visitor. Detective Martinez called for backup immediately. Within minutes, the small interview room filled with tension as Captain James Rogers joined them. The captain, a stocky man with 30 years on the force, studied Michael carefully. "Mr. Warner, you understand the seriousness of what you're telling us?" Captain Rogers asked, his voice deep and measured. Michael nodded slowly. "I do. My son Thomas has been troubled for years, but I never thought he would go this far." Detective Martinez spread the 3 diamond rings on the table. These matched the descriptions from all 3 robbery reports. "How did you get them?" Michael's shoulders slumped slightly. The confident man who had walked into the station now looked like a worried father. "I found them yesterday in my garage. Thomas has been staying with me for the past month. He said he lost his apartment and needed a place to stay until he found work." Michael paused, his fingers tapping nervously on the table. "I was cleaning out some old boxes when I noticed a new toolbox I didn't recognize. These were inside, wrapped in a cloth." Captain Rogers leaned forward. "And you're sure they belong to your son?" The toolbox had his name on it, and Michael reached into his pocket again and pulled out a small notebook. I found this too. It has details about the jewelry stores, opening times, security systems, escape routes. Detective Martinez took the notebook carefully, using a pen to flip through the pages. Her eyes widened as she scanned the contents. This is definitely evidence, she confirmed to the captain. There are plans here for another robbery. Tomorrow night. The atmosphere in the room changed. What had started as a surprising confession was now a time-sensitive case. "Where is your son now, Mr. Warner?" Captain Rogers asked. "I don't know. When I confronted him about what I found, he took off. That was last night around 8. He didn't take his car or his phone. Both are still at my house." Detective Martinez was already on her feet, calling in Thomas Warner's description to patrol units across the city. She requested photographs and any records they had on him. Michael pulled out his wallet and handed over a recent picture of the son. Thomas looked like a younger version of his father, except his eyes held none of Michael's dignity or calmness. "I never thought I'd be sitting in a police station turning in my own son," Michael said quietly. "But after my wife died 3 years ago, Thomas changed. He started hanging around with the wrong people, lost his job, started asking for money all the time." Captain Rogers nodded sympathetically. "You're doing the right thing, Mr. Warner. You might be saving your son's life by coming here today." An officer knocked on the door, bringing in a file. Detective Martinez opened it and spread several papers in front of Michael. "Is this your son's handwriting?" she asked, pointing to notes they had found at one of the crime scenes. Michael studied the paper and nodded. "Yes, that's his writing. He always made his eyes like that, with the tail going straight down." As they continued talking, the police station buzzed with activity. Officers were preparing to search for Thomas Warner. Others were investigating his background, looking for known associates who might be hiding him. "There's something else," Michael said, his voice dropping even lower. "Thomas mentioned someone named Victor. Said this Victor person had connections and knew how to move stolen goods quickly." Detective Martinez and Captain Rogers exchanged glances. Victor Mendez was a name they knew well, a suspected fence who had managed to stay just beyond their reach for years. "Mr. Warner," Captain Rogers said, "what you've done today might help us solve more than just the Henderson robberies. But we need to act fast if we're going to catch your son before the next robbery happens." Michael nodded, his face a mixture of determination and heartbreak. "Whatever you need me to do, I'll help. But please, try not to hurt him. He's still my son." The Las Vegas Police Department transformed into a hive of activity. Officers moved with purpose while Michael sat in the break room, a cup of untouched coffee growing cold in front of him. Through the glass walls, he could see the command center where Detective Martinez was organizing the search for his son. "Mr. Warner." A young officer appeared at the doorway. "Detective Martinez would like you to join the briefing." Michael followed the officer to a large room where about 15 police officers had gathered. Maps of Las Vegas covered one wall, with red pins marking the locations of the 3 jewelry store robberies. A fourth pin, this one yellow, marked what they believed would be Thomas's next target. "This is Michael Warner, Thomas's father." Detective Martinez introduced him to the room. "He'll be helping us understand his son's patterns and possible hideouts." Michael felt all eyes on him. Some officers looked curious, others sympathetic. A few seemed suspicious, as if wondering whether he was somehow involved in his son's crimes. "Before we continue," Captain Rogers said, "we have a possible sighting of Thomas Warner." Everyone's attention turned to a television screen where security footage began to play. The grainy black and white video showed a man entering a motel on the outskirts of town. Even with the poor quality, Michael recognized his son's walk, slightly leaning to the right from an old football injury. "That's him," Michael confirmed. "That's Thomas." "This footage is from 2 hours ago at the Desert Moon Motel," Detective Martinez explained. "We have officers on the way there now, but we need to approach carefully. Based on the robbery notes, we believe Thomas may be armed." Michael's face paled. "He owns a hunting rifle, but I've never known him to carry a handgun." Captain Rogers nodded. "We'll proceed with caution. Mr. Warner, we'd like you to come with us, but you'll stay in the car with an officer. If we need to communicate with Thomas, having you there might help." For the next 30 minutes, they planned the operation. Michael provided details about his son, his temperament, how he reacted when cornered, and what might convince him to surrender peacefully. As they prepared to leave, Detective Martinez pulled Michael aside. "There's something I need to ask you," she said quietly. "Your son's notes mentioned a big score after the jewelry stores. Any idea what he might be planning?" Michael shook his head. "Thomas never shared much with me about his life anymore." But he hesitated. "Last week, he asked strange questions about my security company. I own Warner Security. We handle systems for several casinos." Martinez's expression turned serious. "Which casinos?" "The Oasis, Diamond Palace, and the Grand Imperial." She quickly made notes. "We'll need to alert their security teams. If Thomas is planning something bigger than jewelry store robberies, we need to be prepared." The drive to the Desert Moon Motel took 20 minutes. Michael sat in the back of an unmarked police car, watching as police vehicles strategically positioned themselves around the motel. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot as officers in tactical gear quietly took their positions. Room 117 came the radio confirmation. "Suspect is believed to be inside." Michael watched anxiously as Detective Martinez and Captain Rogers approached the room from different angles. Other officers covered the back window and possible escape routes. Martinez knocked on the door. "Thomas Warner, this is the Las Vegas Police Department. We need to speak with you." Silence. She knocked again, more firmly. "Thomas, your father is here. He's concerned about you." Michael held his breath. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, unexpectedly, the door opened just a crack. Through the opening, Thomas's voice came out, sounding tired and resigned. "Dad's here? Really?" "Yes," Martinez confirmed. "He wants to help you." There was a long pause, and Michael leaned forward in his seat, straining to hear. "Tell him." Thomas's voice cracked slightly. "Tell him I'm sorry, but it's too late to stop now." The door slammed shut, followed by the sound of breaking glass from inside the room. "He's going out the back window." An officer shouted over the radio, in pursuit. Chaos erupted around the Desert Moon Motel. Police officers sprinted between buildings while radios crackled with urgent updates. Michael jumped out of the car despite the officers' protests, desperate to see what was happening. "Thomas," he called out, his voice nearly lost in the commotion. Through the maze of motel buildings, Michael caught glimpses of his son. Thomas was running fast, dodging between parked cars and jumping over a small fence. 2 officers were close behind him. "Please don't hurt him," Michael shouted to anyone who would listen. Detective Martinez appeared beside him, slightly out of breath. "Mr. Warner, you need to stay back. We're trying to contain the situation without anyone getting hurt." A police helicopter appeared overhead, its spotlight searching the area as dusk began to fall over Las Vegas. The sharp contrast of light and shadow made the scene look like something from a movie, except this was Michael's real life falling apart before his eyes. "He's heading toward the abandoned warehouse," someone called over the radio. Martinez grabbed her radio. "All units, be advised, suspect is heading to the Mason Street warehouse. Approach with caution. We don't know if he has accomplices inside." Michael felt his heart pounding. "Let me talk to him," he pleaded. "If I can just talk to him." Martinez hesitated, then nodded. "We'll try to set up communication once we have the area secured. But you stay with Officer Davis for now." She pointed to a young officer who stepped forward to guide Michael back to the car. For the next 20 minutes, Michael sat anxiously in the police car, watching as more officers arrived and surrounded the old warehouse. The building had once been used for storing casino equipment, but had been empty for years. A perfect hiding place. Captain Rogers approached the car and opened the door. "Mr. Warner, we've established a perimeter around the warehouse. Thomas is inside, and he's alone as far as we can tell." "Has he said anything?" "Not yet. We tried calling his phone, but he's not answering. That's why we want to try your suggestion." The captain handed Michael a megaphone. "We'll take you close enough for him to hear you, but you'll stay behind our protective line." Michael nodded, his hand trembling slightly as he took the megaphone. They walked carefully toward the warehouse, stopping about 50 yards from the main entrance. Police officers with shields formed a protective barrier around Michael. "Whenever you're ready," Captain Rogers said quietly. Michael raised the megaphone to his lips. "Thomas, Son, it's Dad. His voice echoed across the empty lot. I know you're scared right now. I am too. There was no response from the warehouse. Only the distant sound of traffic and the helicopter circling overhead broke the silence. Thomas, I know things haven't been right since your mother died. I know I wasn't there for you like I should have been. Michael's voice cracked with emotion. But I'm here now. Whatever you've done, we can face it together. A shadow moved past one of the warehouse windows. Then, unexpectedly, Thomas's voice called back. Why did you turn me in, Dad? The pain in his voice was unmistakable. You could have just talked to me first. Michael looked at Martinez, who nodded encouragingly. Because I was afraid, son, afraid of what might happen to you if you kept going down this path. I couldn't stand by and watch you throw your life away. A long silence followed. The police officers remained tense, weapons ready but not aimed directly at the building. There are things you don't understand, Dad, Thomas finally replied. I'm not just robbing stores for fun. Victor has my girlfriend. If I don't deliver what he wants, he'll hurt her. Detective Martinez and Captain Rogers exchanged surprised looks. This was new information that changed everything about the case. Thomas, Michael said firmly into the megaphone, the police can help with that. But you need to come out with your hands up. Then we can save your girlfriend together. Another silence followed, longer this time. Then, slowly, the warehouse door began to open. Thomas stepped out of the warehouse with his hands raised above his head. In the fading daylight, Michael could see how much his son had changed. Thomas looked thinner than he remembered, his face unshaven, his eyes darting nervously from side to side. He wore a plain black t-shirt and jeans, both looking worn and dirty. Don't shoot, Michael called out to the officers, though none had raised their weapons. Detective Martinez stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. Thomas Warner, you need to lie down on the ground with your hands behind your head. Thomas looked at his father one last time, then slowly did as he was told. Two officers approached cautiously, secured his hands with handcuffs, and helped him to his feet. As they led him toward a police car, Michael rushed forward. I need to talk to him, he insisted. Captain Rogers nodded, and the officers paused, allowing Michael to speak with his son. Who is your girlfriend? Michael asked urgently. Where is she? Thomas looked down, avoiding his father's eyes. Her name is Alicia. Victor is holding her at his place in North Las Vegas. He gave me until tomorrow night to deliver the security codes for the Grand Imperial Casino. Detective Martinez, who had moved closer to listen, immediately got on her radio. I need a team at all known addresses for Victor Mendez. Possible hostage situation. I never meant for any of this to happen, Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper. Alicia and I needed money. Victor offered us a simple job, just information gathering. But once we started, he wouldn't let us stop. Michael placed a hand on his son's shoulder. We'll find her, Thomas. But you need to tell the police everything you know. As Thomas was placed in the back of a police car, Michael turned to Martinez. I want to go with you to find Alicia. The detective shook her head. That's not possible, Mr. Warner. This is now a high-risk operation. Victor Mendez is dangerous. He's been linked to at least 3 violent crimes in the past year. But my son... Your son will be processed at the station, Captain Rogers explained. He'll be charged with the robberies, but his cooperation in finding Victor and the hostage will help his case. Michael watched helplessly as the police car carrying Thomas drove away. The sky had darkened completely now, and the police lights painted everything in flashing red and blue. Back at the station, Michael waited in the same interview room where his day had begun. How different things looked now. What had started as him turning in his son had turned into a race to save a young woman's life. Detective Martinez entered the room, looking tired but focused. We have good news. Based on Thomas's information, we've identified 3 possible locations where Victor might be holding Alicia. SWAT teams are preparing to check all 3 simultaneously. How long will that take? We move in 1 hour. Until then, Thomas is helping our team with detailed layouts of each location. Michael nodded, feeling a strange mix of pride and sorrow. His son had made terrible mistakes, but at least now he was trying to make things right. Can I see him before you go? Michael asked. Martinez hesitated, then nodded. 5 minutes. He's in a secure interview room down the hall. As Michael woke to see his son, he thought about how quickly life could change. This morning, he had been a respected businessman whose biggest worry was his troubled son. Now, he was part of a police operation that might save a life or end in tragedy. When he entered the room and saw Thomas looking up at him, Michael realized something important. No matter what happened next, they would face it as father and son. The atmosphere at the Las Vegas Police Department grew increasingly tense as the operation to rescue Alicia approached. Officers moved with purpose, checking weapons and radios. SWAT team members in black tactical gear gathered in the briefing room, studying maps of the 3 possible locations. Michael sat beside Thomas in a small office, away from the main activity. They had been given these few precious minutes together while the rescue operation was being prepared. "Tell me about Alicia," Michael said gently. "How did you meet her?" Thomas's eyes, so much like his mother's, softened slightly. "At the community college. I was taking night classes, trying to get my life back together after Mom died. Alicia was studying business." He smiled faintly at the memory. "She believed in me when nobody else did." Michael felt a stab of guilt. Had he given up on his son too easily after his wife's death? Had he been so lost in his own grief that he'd failed to see Thomas's pain? "How did Victor Mendez find you?" he asked. Thomas sighed, the handcuffs on his wrists clinking as he shifted position. "He approached us outside the college one night, said he recognized me as Michael Warner's son, offered us easy money just to gather information about your security systems." Thomas looked down. By the time we realized what he really wanted, it was too late. He had pictures of us from the first jewelry store job, used them to blackmail us into continuing. A knock at the door interrupted them. Detective Martinez entered, her face serious. "It's time. The teams are moving out." Thomas leaned forward urgently. "Remember, Victor always has at least 2 armed guards with him, and he wears a gun in an ankle holster, easy to miss if you don't know it's there." Martinez nodded. "We'll be careful. You've given us good information, Thomas. That counts for something." As Thomas was led back to his holding cell, he turned to his father one last time. "Dad, I'm sorry for everything. Whatever happens with Alicia, I know I have to pay for what I did." Michael watched as his son disappeared down the hallway, escorted by 2 officers. Despite everything, he felt a strange sense of pride. Thomas had made terrible mistakes, but he was trying to make things right. Captain Rogers approached Michael. "We've set up a waiting area where you can stay during the operation. One of our officers will keep you updated." "I want to be closer," Michael insisted. "This is partly my fault. I should have seen what was happening with my son." Rogers studied him for a moment, then nodded. "You can wait in the command center, but you stay back and don't interfere with operations." The command center was a large room filled with screens and communication equipment. Officers monitored radio traffic as the 3 SWAT teams moved into position around Las Vegas. "Team Alpha in position at the North Vegas warehouse," came a voice over the radio. "Team Bravo ready at the Henderson house. Team Charlie approaching the downtown apartment building." Michael stood silently in the back of the room, watching as tiny dots representing officers moved on digital maps of the city. Martinez stood near the main communications desk, directing the operation alongside Captain Rogers. "All teams, execute on my mark," Rogers said into his headset. 3, 2, 1, go. The room fell into a tense silence as they waited for reports from the teams. The only sounds were the soft beeping of equipment and the occasional burst of static from the radios. "Team Alpha, no signs of occupancy at the warehouse. Continuing search." "Team Bravo, Henderson location appears empty. No recent activity." "Team Charlie, we have movement in the apartment. 2 males visible through thermal imaging. No sign of a female subject yet." Martinez leaned forward. "Charlie team, proceed with caution. Remember, hostage safety is priority 1. Michael held his breath as the radio fell silent again. Then suddenly, the calm was shattered by the sound of gunfire coming through the speakers. "Shots fired. Shots fired at Charlie location." A voice shouted over the radio. "Suspect is down. Searching for the hostage." The command center erupted with activity. Officers shouted into radios while others huddled around screens showing the downtown apartment building. Michael stood frozen in place, unable to move as the chaos unfolded around him. "Charlie team, report." Captain Rogers demanded, his voice cutting through the noise. Static crackled over the radio before a response came through. One suspect down, not Mendez. Second suspect barricaded in back bedroom. No visual on the hostage yet. Michael's heart pounded in his chest. Somewhere in that apartment building, a young woman's life hung in the balance, all because his son had gotten tangled up with Victor Mendez. They'd found something, Detective Martinez said, pointing to one of the screens where officers appeared to be examining a door. Charlie team to command. We've located a hidden room behind a false wall, attempting entry now. The entire command center fell silent. Michael could hear his own breathing, too loud in the quiet room. He thought of Thomas, sitting alone in his cell, waiting to learn Alicia's fate. Command, this is Charlie team. We have the female hostage. Repeat, we have the hostage. She's alive. A collective sigh of relief swept through the room. Officers clapped each other on the back while Martinez closed her eyes briefly, allowing herself a moment of relief. And Mendez? Rogers asked into the radio. No sign of him, sir. The second suspect claims Mendez left about an hour before we arrived. Said he got a phone call and took off. Martinez slammed her hand against the desk. He knew we were coming. Someone tipped him off. All units, Rogers commanded, be on high alert for Victor Mendez. Consider him armed and extremely dangerous. Michael approached Martinez cautiously. What about the girl, Alicia? Is she hurt? Martinez's expression softened slightly. Medics are checking her now, but initial reports say she's physically okay. Dehydrated and frightened, but no serious injuries. Can I tell Thomas? Martinez nodded. I'll have an officer take you to him. As Michael followed an officer through the station corridors, he felt a strange mixture of emotions. Relief that Alicia was safe, worried that Mendez was still free, and uncertainty about what would happen to his son now. Thomas looked up as the cell door opened. His face was pale with worry. Did they find her? He asked immediately, standing up from the narrow bed. Michael nodded. She's safe, Thomas. A little dehydrated, but otherwise unharmed. Thomas's legs seemed to give way beneath him as he sank back onto the bed. Tears streamed down his face, the first time Michael had seen his son cry since his mother's funeral. Thank God, Thomas whispered. I thought. I was afraid. Michael sat beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. She's going to be okay. But Mendez got away before the police arrived. Thomas looked up sharply. He's still out there. Yes, the police have alerts out everywhere. They'll find him. Thomas shook his head slowly. You don't understand. If he got away, that means he had warning. He has connections everywhere, maybe even in the police department. Before Michael could respond, Detective Martinez appeared at the cell door. Her expression was grim. Mr. Warner, I need to speak with you immediately. Michael followed her to a quiet corner of the hallway. We just received a call from security at the Grand Imperial Casino, she said quietly. Someone has been attempting to access their system using your company's codes. Michael felt his blood run cold. That's impossible. Those codes change daily, and only I have the master access. Martinez's eyes narrowed. When was the last time you checked your secure files? This morning, before I. Michael's voice trailed off as realization hit him. While he had been focused on turning in his son and the stolen jewelry, had Mendez been after something much bigger all along? We need to get to the casino, Martinez said urgently. Now. Las Vegas erupted in flashing lights as police vehicles raced toward the Grand Imperial Casino. Michael sat in the passenger seat of Detective Martinez's car, his mind racing faster than the vehicle speeding through night traffic. How much access would these codes give someone? Martinez asked, her eyes fixed on the road as she swerved around a slow-moving taxi. Everything, Michael replied grimly. The security systems, the vault codes, camera controls, my company designed the entire system. The Grand Imperial Casino stood like a glittering mountain against the night sky. Its famous gold-tinted windows reflected the neon lights of the Strip, making the building appear to be on fire with color. As they pulled up to the main entrance, security guards immediately recognized Martinez's police vehicle and directed them to a side entrance. The casino's head of security, a former FBI agent named Wilson, met them at the door. We've locked down the vault area, Wilson explained as he led them through the casino's back hallways. But whoever is doing this is good. They've managed to disable certain camera feeds and alarm triggers. The security control room buzzed with activity. Technicians worked frantically at computer terminals while security staff communicated with guards positioned throughout the massive building. There, Wilson pointed to a monitor showing a darkened corridor. That's the last place we saw movement before the cameras went down. It's the service hallway leading to the main vault. Martinez immediately radioed for backup. All available units to the Grand Imperial Casino vault area. Suspect Victor Mendez may be on premises. Michael studied the casino layout on a large wall display. There's another way into that corridor, he said suddenly, pointing to a maintenance access point. It's not on the main plans, but my team added it during the last system upgrade. Martinez nodded. Wilson, get your men to cover the main entrance to the vault. Mr. Warner and I will check this maintenance access. As they hurried through the casino's maze-like back areas, Michael felt a surge of determination. This had all started with his morning visit to the police station. Now it would end tonight, one way or another. The maintenance access door was hidden behind a storage rack. Martinez drew her weapon as Michael carefully moved the rack aside. The door was slightly ajar. "Stay behind me," Martinez whispered as she slowly pushed the door open. The narrow corridor beyond was dimly lit by emergency lights. They moved silently, Martinez leading the way with her gun held ready. As they approached a junction in the corridor, they heard voices, one of which Michael recognized immediately. "Hurry up with those codes," Victor Mendez's voice echoed slightly in the concrete hallway. "We got less than 2 minutes before the system resets." Martinez signaled for Michael to stay back as she peered around the corner. She quickly pulled back and whispered, "2 men, Mendez and someone working on the vault controls, both armed." She radioed their position to the backup units, then turned to Michael. "I need a distraction, something that will draw their attention without putting you at risk." Michael thought for a moment, then nodded toward a fire alarm on the wall. "That will trigger in this section only, and it will confuse the security system further." Martinez considered this, then nodded. "On my signal." She positioned herself at the corner, weapon ready. "Now." Michael pulled the fire alarm. Immediately, a piercing sound filled the corridor, and emergency lights began flashing. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. As Mendez and his accomplice turned toward the sound, Martinez stepped around the corner, her weapon raised. "Police, freeze." Mendez reached for his ankle holster, just as Thomas had warned, but before he could draw his weapon, Martinez fired once. Mendez fell, clutching his shoulder, his gun clattering to the floor. Backup officers swarmed in from the other entrance, quickly securing both Mendez and his accomplice. As Martinez read them their rights, Michael looked at Mendez, the man who had manipulated his son and nearly destroyed their family. Mendez glared back, his eyes cold with hatred. "It's over," Michael said quietly. Later, as dawn broke over Las Vegas, Michael sat with Thomas and Alicia in an interview room at the police station. Detective Martinez had just informed them that Thomas would be charged, but his cooperation would be noted. "What happens now?" Thomas asked, holding Alicia's hand tightly. Michael looked at his son, really looked at him for the first time in years. "We rebuild," he said simply. "Together."